At 9:17 on the morning of January 22nd, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George crouched in the shattered concrete of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz, his cheek pressed against a scope most of his fellow officers still called a joke. 240 yards away, a banyan tree loomed out of the humid haze, its branches a tangle of shadow and leaves. Somewhere in that tangle, a man might be waiting to kill him. John George was 27 years old, an Illinois state rifle champion, a man who could stack shots on paper at 1,000 yards, and yet, in the chaos of Guadalcanal, he had exactly 0 confirmed kills. The Japanese had 11 snipers working the groves around Point Cruz. In just 72 hours, those snipers had killed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. The jungle was swallowing his battalion one man at a time, and the best shot in the regiment hadn't fired his special rifle in anger even once. The men around him trusted the M1 Garand, 9.5 pounds of walnut and steel, 8 rounds of 30-06, semi-automatic, rugged, ugly, standard issue. George had brought something different to war, a sleek Winchester Model 70 with a Lyman Alaskan scope in a Griffin and Howe mount, a rifle he'd bought with 2 years of National Guard pay and a lifetime of obsession. When he'd unboxed it back at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the battalion armorer had snorted and asked if it was meant for deer or Germans. George said neither. Japanese, he'd answered, as if he could already see the banyan trees waiting for him across the Pacific. His superiors weren't impressed. George's commanding officer called it a toy. Other platoon leaders joked that he'd brought his mail-order sweetheart to war. The Winchester was bolt action, 5 rounds. The Garand was semi-automatic, 8 rounds of fast fire. The Garand had no magnification. George's scope added 12 ounces and the promise of distant surgical shots. On paper, it sounded like a fine way to get killed in a jungle where enemies were rarely seen beyond 50 yards. Then the war moved faster than the mail. The battalion shipped out before George's Winchester arrived. He spent the voyage to Guadalcanal watching other men strip and oil their Garands while the one rifle he trusted sat in a warehouse in Illinois. From the deck of the transport, he sent a request through military mail, asking that the rifle be forwarded to the front. For 6 long weeks he fought with whatever weapon he was handed, knowing the rifle he understood best was somewhere in transit, wrapped in cosmoline and bureaucracy. In late December 1942, after the 132nd Infantry had relieved the exhausted Marines on Guadalcanal, a supply sergeant finally shoved a wooden crate into George's hands. Fragile, the stencil said. Inside lay the Winchester Model 70, heavy with the smell of grease and promise. 9 pounds of rifle, 12 extra ounces of glass. No one else in the battalion carried anything like it. Captain Morris ordered him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and take a real weapon. George nodded and carried the Winchester anyway. By then, the Marines had already seized Henderson Field and bled for it since August. They had not taken Mount Austin, 1,514 feet of jungle and rock, the Japanese called the Gifu. There, 500 Japanese soldiers and 47 bunkers had stalled American attacks. George's battalion went in on December 17th. They fought for 16 days, losing 34 killed and 279 wounded, before finally taking the western slope on January 2nd. Through all of it, George's Winchester stayed silent. Not one combat shot. The jungle west of the Matanikau River, around Point Cruz, was different. There were no neat bunker lines, no fixed positions, just massive trees and men who had melted backward into them. Japanese soldiers who had retreated from Henderson Field climbed into banyan and palm trees before dawn and stayed there, invisible, until darkness returned. Some carried scoped Arisaka Type 98 rifles. They knew the jungle. They knew how to wait. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he was filling canteens at a creek. On the 20th, another killed 2 men from L Company on patrol. On the 21st, 3 more Americans died. One was shot through the neck from a tree their patrol had walked past twice. That night, the battalion commander sent for John George. The snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could shoot, and a reason to believe that toy rifle could actually change the balance. George laid out his credentials. Illinois state champion at 1,000 yards in 1939, youngest winner in the state's history. 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. With the Lyman Alaskan, 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. The commander gave him until morning to prove it. If you want to see how George's mail-order hunting rifle performed against Japanese snipers trained for jungle warfare, stay with this story. What happens next turns a toy into the most feared weapon in the groves of Point Cruz. Dawn on January 22nd broke gray and heavy over the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. The air was already thick, the kind of heat that made a man sweat just by breathing. George moved alone into the ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier, a concrete scar looking out over the trees where the snipers lived. No spotter, no radio man, no backup, just his Winchester, a canteen, and 60 rounds of 30 to 6 inches stripper clips. If the rifle failed, there would be no excuse. If he failed, more men would die. The bunker overlooked a stretch of jungle that intelligence had marked with a simple, chilling note: sniper activity, banyan trees. Some of those banyans soared 90 feet high on trunks 8 feet thick, their roots like twisted pillars. A man could climb into one before dawn and vanish until nightfall, unseen even by patrols that passed directly beneath. George settled into the rubble, pushed broken coral and sandbags into a rough firing rest, and lifted the Lyman Alaskan to his eye. 2.5 power magnification wasn't much, but it turned featureless green into a layered world of shadows and tiny movements. The jungle was never quiet. Birds screamed, insects hummed, artillery rumbled somewhere beyond the trees. George had learned to let the noise wash over him, to hunt in the space between sounds. He glassed each tree the same way he'd learned to scan a target line at Camp Perry. Left to right, top to bottom, then back again, slow enough that his eyes could catch anything that didn't belong. At 9:17, he saw it. One branch on a banyan, 240 yards out, shifted just slightly. There was no wind, no bird landing, just a subtle, unnatural tremor 87 feet up. George froze, then eased his focus onto that spot. The branch moved again, and then the shape resolved itself. A man in dark clothing tucked into a fork where 3 thick limbs met, facing east, watching the supply trail George's battalion had been using all week. He dialed 2 clicks right for wind, though there was barely any, more out of ingrained habit than necessity. The Winchester's trigger broke like glass at 3.5 pounds, exactly as he had tuned it in peacetime on American ranges. This shot would decide whether a state championship meant anything in a jungle where the targets shot back. He exhaled, paused, and squeezed. The rifle kicked, and the crack rolled through the trees. In the banyan, the sniper jerked as if yanked by an invisible rope, then dropped. His body crashed through the branches, tumbled the full 90 feet, and hit the ground at the base of the tree in a limp heap. George worked the bolt automatically, steel running smooth under his hand. One empty cartridge spun away, another round slid into the chamber. He kept the crosshairs on the tree. Japanese sniper doctrine favored teams, shooter and spotter. If the man he'd just killed was the shooter, his partner was somewhere close, maybe higher in the same tree, maybe in another. He began searching again, forcing the low-powered scope to work for him. The limited magnification meant he had to move it slowly, tracing every crook and shadow. The scale of the banyan canopy turned into a maze. At 9:43, he found the second man. Different tree, 60 yards north of the first, lower down maybe 50 feet off the ground. This one was moving. The spotter was shimmying down the trunk, retreating. He had heard the shot and knew his position was compromised. George led the motion just a hair, saw the shape slide across the reticle, and pressed the trigger. The second sniper fell backward into space, his Arisaka clattering through the branches a heartbeat before his body smashed into the jungle floor. 2 shots. 2 dead snipers. For the first time, the Winchester spoke in war, and it spoke convincingly. George reloaded with a stripper clip, 5 rounds pushed down into the magazine in one practiced movement. His hands were steady, his breathing calm. The bunker, the heat, the stench of rotting vegetation, it all faded behind the familiar tunnel of shooter and target. This wasn't the orderly world of Camp Perry, but the fundamentals were the same. See, calculate, commit. At 11:21, the jungle reminded him that the enemy could shoot back. A Japanese bullet slammed into a sandbag 6 inches from his head, blasting grit into his eyes and mouth. He rolled left, flattening himself against the bunker wall, while his heart hammered against his ribs. The angle of the impact told him the shot had come from the southwest, not from the trees where he'd just killed. Somewhere out there, Another sniper had taken his measure and fired. He waited 3 long minutes before sliding back to the firing slit and lifting the scope. Any sniper who survived long in the jungle knew to move after firing, shoot, relocate, disappear. But the jungle limited options. George methodically worked the line of banyans to the southwest, tree by tree. At 11:38 he saw him, third tree from the left in a tight cluster of 5, 73 feet up, dark cloth blending against the trunk. The sniper had shifted to a different branch in the same tree instead of moving to a new one. That was a mistake. George didn't. He pressed the trigger and watched the man simply drop, swallowed by the leaves without a sound. By noon, 5 Japanese snipers were dead. The story ran through the battalion like electricity. Men who'd laughed at his mail-order sweetheart now whispered about the lieutenant in the bunker who was killing ghosts in the trees with a hunting rifle. Some wanted to come watch him work, like it was a show. George refused. Extra eyes meant extra movement. Movement meant attention. And on Guadalcanal, attention meant incoming fire. The Japanese learned too. After the 5th kill, the trees went still. No telltale shifts, no silhouettes crossing against the sky. The remaining snipers had decided that sunlight meant death. They froze in place and hunted only with their eyes. George spent the rest of the afternoon scanning and seeing nothing but the patient, impenetrable jungle. At 1,600 hours, he finally pulled back to battalion headquarters, sweat-soaked and gritty. Captain Morris was waiting, the mockery gone from his face. He didn't call the Winchester a toy this time. He simply told George to be back in position at dawn. Tomorrow, the duel would continue. January 23rd didn't so much dawn as leak into existence under a curtain of water. Heavy tropical rain hammered the coconut palms and banyans, turning the jungle floor into a soup of mud and rotting leaves. Visibility shrank to 100 yards, then 50, then less. George still went back to the bunker. You didn't change a routine that had just killed 5 enemy snipers in one day. He sat in the dim, dripping ruin, the Winchester across his knees, listening to the rain roar against the cracked concrete overhead. The Lyman Alaskan fogged and cleared, as humid air pressed in from the firing slit. If he were a Japanese sniper, he thought, this is when he'd move. The sound of the storm-covered noise, masked motion, erased the tiny slips and creaks that betrayed a climber on a tree trunk. At 8:15, the worst of the rain broke. By 8:45, the world beyond the bunker was still a gray blur, but the trees were more than just silhouettes. That was enough to work with. George settled in behind the scope and began his slow sweep of the banyan grove. The routine had become ritual, top to bottom, left to right, no rushed passes, no impatient shortcuts. At 9:12, almost the same minute as yesterday's first kill, he found his 6th sniper. This one was clever. The Japanese soldier had climbed during the rain and chosen a tree farther out, about 290 yards away, longer than any shot George had taken so far on Guadalcanal. Range alone wouldn't save him. George knew the drop of a 30-06 round at that distance the way some men knew hymns. He adjusted, calculated subconsciously, and pressed the trigger. The dark shape slumped and toppled. Another body falling from the sky. Another rifle silenced. The Japanese changed their answer. At 9:57, the jungle around the bunker erupted. A mortar round exploded 40 yards short, showering debris across the old concrete. George flinched as shards of coral and rock rattled around him. A second salvo landed closer, 20 yards out this time. They were walking the rounds in, triangulating from sound, muzzle flash, a pattern of broken branches, some tiny thread he'd left them. The third salvo would land on the bunker. George didn't wait to test the math. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition, slid out the back of the ruin, and ran north along the tree line, hunched low, each step a battle against sucking mud. He dove into a shell crater just as the next round screamed in. The bunker he had occupied minutes before disintegrated in a wall of noise and flying concrete. The position where the American's new ghost had lived was gone. For a moment, he lay still in the crater, heart pounding, Winchester clutched to his chest. This was the other half of the equation. For every shot he took, the jungle was taking aim at him. Then he crawled out, moved again, this time to a fallen tree, about 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. A long, mossy corpse pointing toward the groves. It offered a new angle and decent cover. He settled in, belly down behind the trunk, and lifted the scope once more. They sent more snipers that afternoon. The duel had become personal. The men in the trees knew someone was systematically killing them, and they were determined to return the favor. George answered with the same patience that had won him trophies back in Illinois. At 14:23, he caught a sniper exposing just a sliver of profile while repositioning. One round dropped him. Kill 7. At 15:41, he spotted another high up 94 feet in the air, almost perfectly hidden. As the sun shifted, that height betrayed the man, silhouetting him against a thin slice of sky. George took the shot. Kill 8. By 1700 hours, when Captain Morris's runner finally found him to call him back, George had been in the fight for 9 hours. He returned to headquarters, mud-caked, exhausted, but upright. Morris didn't bother with jokes. He wanted numbers. 8 confirmed dead snipers in 2 days. 12 rounds fired at them. 11 hits, 4 misses total in the entire operation when you counted shots that didn't find their mark. Then, the brief, violent brush with Japanese mortars. Morris didn't hesitate. George was now the battalion's sniper, whether the Army's paperwork recognized such a title or not. He was ordered back into position at dawn on January 24th to finish the job. That night, in his tent, George cleaned the Winchester with almost religious care. Cosmoline was long gone, replaced by jungle grit and fine dust. He ran patches through the barrel until they came out clean, checked screws, mounts, trigger pull. There were, intelligence said, 11 Japanese snipers in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were dead. 3 remained the best survivors, the ones who had watched friends fall from trees and still hadn't exposed themselves. Those 3 now knew exactly what George's rifle sounded like. They knew roughly where he liked to set up, and somewhere, as rain began again at 4:15, they were thinking about how to hunt the man who had turned the groves into a graveyard. George lay awake with the rifle across his lap, listening to the storm, doing the same math. Rain drummed on the canvas of George's tent through the early hours of January 24th, a steady percussion that made sleep impossible. At 3, he gave up trying. He sat with the Winchester across his knees, listening to the storm, and thinking about 3 men he had never seen but knew too well, the last snipers in the Point Cruz groves. By 4:15, the rain swelled into a downpour, the kind that erased footprints and swallowed sound. If he stayed in his old positions, he'd be predictable. Predictable meant dead. Before dawn, he moved. Not back to the crater, not to the fallen tree, and certainly not to what used to be the bunker. He chose a new perch, a cluster of large rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest in December. From there, he had elevation and overlapping fields of fire into the banyans and coconut palms. He settled among the stones, becoming another shadow, and waited for the rain to slacken. At 7:43, the storm faded to a drizzle. The air turned clear enough to work. George lifted the scope and began his careful, methodical search. The trees were old friends now. He knew their outlines, their forks and scars. Any change, however small, might be a man. At 8:17, he found one sniper number 9, or so it seemed. The Japanese soldier was in a palm tree 190 yards out, low by sniper standards, only 40 feet up. The palm fronds cupped around him like fingers, making a natural hide that would be invisible from ground level. But George wasn't at ground level. From his elevated rocks, he could look down into the fan of leaves and see the dark curve of shoulders, the hint of a helmet. He settled the crosshairs, began to squeeze, then stopped. Something was wrong. It was too perfect, too visible from his new angle, too obvious for a man who'd survived 3 days of lethal lessons. The last snipers wouldn't make beginners' mistakes. He backed off, widened his view, and started searching not for the man in the palm, but for whoever was covering him. If the palm sniper was bait, the real threat would be somewhere with a line of sight to anyone who fired at him, probably with a view of George's previous fallen tree position. At 8:28, the real danger appeared in the glass. A banyan 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. Branches, vines, and hanging roots wrapped the figure in camouflage, leaving only the slightest suggestion of form. From that height, the sniper had a perfect angle on the old position. He was waiting for George to show himself or to take the too easy shot at the palm. George made his play. He pointed the Winchester at the decoy in the palm, adjusted for the light wind, and fired. The bait jerked and fell, crashing through fronds. Before the body even hit, George swung the rifle to the banyan. He didn't look for a full silhouette. He looked for movement, for reaction. There, a small shift as the hidden sniper turned toward the sound of the shot. George pressed the trigger. The real killer tumbled out of his perfect hide, his rifle following him down. 2 shots, 2 more snipers gone. But now his true position was no mystery. Anyone watching the execution of that trap knew exactly where the American marksman was. George grabbed his rifle and ammo, slid off the rocks, and ran east along a line of low ground, diving into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He sank into cold, muddy water up to his chest and rested the Winchester on the lip of the ditch. The world narrowed to wet cloth, pounding heart, and the circle of glass. 10 confirmed kills, now. 1 sniper left the best of them, or at least the luckiest. He scanned the trees for nearly an hour, studying every knot and shadow. The lineman showed him dark patches, but distance and foliage turned everything into guesswork. At 9:47, realization hit him like a slap. The last sniper wasn't in the trees at all. Movement brushed across the edge of his vision, 60 yards south, low to the ground, a shape crawling through the undergrowth parallel to the tree line. The Japanese sniper was using the jungle floor as his own concealment, closing in on George's last known position among the rocks. The hunter had become the hunted. George stayed submerged, the crater lip blocking his angle. To shoot, he'd have to rise and expose himself. So he waited. Sniper work was patience embodied. The Japanese crawled to within 40 yards of the rocks, then into the abandoned machine gun nest, facing east toward where George should be hiding. From 38 yards, George had a clean shot at his back. An easy shot by any standard. He held his fire. The position was too exposed for an experienced sniper to hold. It was bait, again. Somewhere else, another rifle was watching that nest, waiting for the first muzzle flash to bloom. George widened his search one more time. At 10:06, he found the second man, another Japanese soldier 70 yards northwest of the rocks, prone behind a fallen tree, rifle aimed toward the drainage ditch where George lay. 2 men now, not 1. The last threat was a team. Low in the muddy water, Winchester held clear of the surface. George began to plan not 1 shot, but escape from a closing net. George slid lower into the water until only his eyes and the top of his helmet broke the muddy surface. The Winchester he held upright, barrel pointed at the sky to keep it dry. 2 Japanese snipers, whether you called them 10 and 11 or 11 and 12, were executing a careful sweep. 1 man occupied the rocks, the other lay behind the fallen tree, both convinced George was somewhere along the drainage ditch. If he fired now, the bolt-action rifle would betray him. He couldn't drop them both before one returned fire. So he chose patience over pride. At 10:13, the man in the rocks moved first. After 10 minutes of scanning and seeing nothing, he stood, turned, and signaled to his partner. Both began to drift east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart. Working along the route George had used when machine gun fire had driven him from the rocks earlier. They were hunting the escape path. George waited until they passed his crater. Their boots sloshed close enough that he could hear wet leather and whispered words he couldn't understand. When their backs were fully turned, he rose from the water like something dredged from the swamp, Winchester already shouldered. He aimed at the closer man, the one who'd sat in the rocks, now 42 yards away. The crosshairs settled on the center of his back. George fired. The man dropped instantly. The second soldier spun, bringing his rifle up. George worked the bolt by feel, chambering another round as he pivoted in the ditch. The Japanese sniper's barrel was just coming level when the Winchester spoke again. The man crumpled behind the fallen tree. 11 Japanese snipers killed in 3 days. The grove that had butchered 14 Americans in 72 hours had been systematically stripped of its invisible killers by 1 man with a sporting rifle. George climbed out of the crater, water streaming off his uniform, and moved to police his brass by force of habit. That was when he heard the sound that froze him in place. Voices. Japanese voices. Not just 1 or 2, but several, coming from the tree line. He slid back into the crater, sinking down until only his eyes and the top of the scope peeked above the rim. The Winchester stood vertical again. The voices drew closer, brushing through undergrowth, cracking branches. This wasn't a sniper team. It sounded like a patrol or a recovery unit, sent to fetch their elite marksmen or to find whoever killed them. The men reached the first body at 42 yards. George could hear their tones change: shock, anger, surprise, even if he couldn't understand the words. They moved on to the second body, farther out. More voices, sharper now. At 10:28, the sound shifted direction again, heading straight toward his crater. They had found his tracks, the boot prints leading from the rocks to the water-filled hole. George counted bodies in his head. At least 6. 5 rounds in the Winchester. The math was ugly. At 10:31, a helmeted head appeared above the crater rim. A Japanese soldier looked straight down into George's eyes. Training vanished. Instinct took over. George fired from the water, the muzzle blast slamming in his ears at arm's length. The man flew backward out of sight. George worked the bolt underwater, came up higher. 2 more silhouettes filled the rim. He fired, racked, fired again. Both fell. 3 shots, 2 rounds left. Shouts erupted. More men crashed through the foliage, rifles barking wild shots toward the crater and the line of fallen trees. Dirt and leaves kicked up as rounds tore into the ground. George crawled out the north side of the crater, away from the noise, sprinted 20 yards, and threw himself behind another fallen trunk. He pressed the scope to his eye. 2 Japanese soldiers advanced cautiously toward the crater, 50 yards away. He picked the lead man and fired. The soldier crumpled. The second dove for cover. 1 round remained. More voices. Movement behind him now, as another group tried to flank. The jungle was turning into a tightening ring. George didn't need further calculations. A bolt-action rifle against a growing number of infantrymen, this wasn't a duel anymore, it was suicide. He broke contact. Clutching the Winchester, he sprinted north, branches whipping his face, vines clawing his legs. Japanese rifle fire snapped past him, smacking into trunks, stirring splinters. After nearly a minute and a half of running, lungs burning, he dove into a new shell crater, dry this time, and lay there, listening. The shouts faded. The patrol wasn't following. They were staying with their dead. At 10:47, George began the long, low crawl back toward American lines, moving northeast, using folds in the terrain and every bit of jungle cover he could find. By 11:13, he reached the perimeter. A Marine sentry challenged him, then waved him through. At battalion headquarters, Captain Morris wanted the full story. 11 snipers killed, 12 rounds fired at them, 11 hits, then a furious close-range firefight with infantry, 3 more men downed in 5 shots. George had only 2 rounds left in his rifle, and mud in places rifles weren't meant to have mud. Morris didn't chew him out. He told him to clean the Winchester and get some rest. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. On paper, the work was done. But word of what George had done raced upward. That afternoon, orders came from higher. The regiment's colonel wanted to see the lieutenant with the toy rifle that had emptied the trees. Colonel Ferry didn't look like a man interested in toys. When George walked into the regimental command post at 1,400 hours, he found Captain Morris, another staff officer, and Ferry himself waiting around a rough wooden table. Maps of Guadalcanal were spread out, heavy with pencil marks and grease smudges. The colonel asked no small talk, no pleasantries. He went straight to the question. "Lieutenant, can you teach other men to do what you did at Point Cruz?" George thought about it. Shooting was only part of it. The rest was patience, nerves, the willingness to sit in a hole for hours knowing one lazy sweep of the eyes could get you killed. "I can try, sir," he answered, "but I'll need rifles with scopes, men who can already shoot, and time." Ferry had come prepared. The Marines had left behind 14 Springfield 1903 rifles fitted with long uninertal scopes, gangly-looking contraptions by comparison to George's compact Lyman, but purpose-built for precision fire. Somewhere in the regiment were 40 men who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry was willing to give George all of them. "You'll form a sniper section," he said. "You clear any remaining Japanese snipers and support our operations. One condition: it works." George had a condition of his own. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry didn't hesitate. "Keep it," he said. The hunting rifle that had been mocked as a mail-order sweetheart was now the template for a new capability. Training began on January 27th, on a rough range 2 miles east of Henderson Field. The jungle made a ragged backdrop, broken by targets hammered into the earth. The 40 men Ferry had promised arrived in loose formation, experts on paper, not yet in practice. They knew how to qualify with iron sights out to 500 yards. None of them had stalked a man through banyans or watched a body fall 90 feet from a tree. George started with fundamentals: breathing control, trigger squeeze, calling your own shots. The Springfield with Unertel scope weighed around 11 pounds, heavier than the Garand and heavier than his Winchester. The extra mass steadied the rifle but punished men forced to hold it unsupported. He taught them to use whatever the jungle offered: rocks, logs, sandbags, even roots as rests. There were no shooting benches in the groves. For 3 days they fired at stationary targets from 100 to 400 yards. Then came moving silhouettes. Then targets half hidden by vegetation, the way a real enemy would be. A shoulder behind a frond, a helmet above a log. By January 30th, 32 of the 40 men could consistently hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. The spotter carried binoculars and a Garand, watching for threats, while the shooter worked behind glass. After each engagement, the roles could switch. Both men had to be capable of making the shot. On February 1st, George took 4 teams into the field. The mission: clear Japanese remnants west of the Matanikau River. Intelligence said these weren't elite snipers anymore. Just infantry stragglers, men who hadn't yet made it out during the retreat. George paired himself with a spotter, Corporal Hayes, and set up on high ground overlooking a narrow jungle trail used for resupply. At 7:20, a Japanese soldier stepped into view. Hayes confirmed. George fired. 1 man down. Over the next 6 hours, their team hit 7 more targets on that trail. 7 shots, 6 kills, 1 miss, blamed on a fickle gust of wind. The other teams reported similar work. When they regrouped, the ledger read 23 Japanese dead, 0 American casualties. Cold, clinical, effective. The sniper section kept operating into early February. They weren't just avenging Point Cruz anymore. They were shaping the battlefield, picking off runners, breaking up small formations, making every exposed movement a risk for the enemy. By February 9th, their confirmed tally reached 74 Japanese soldiers. That number only included bodies they could see. The real count was probably higher. 2 days earlier, on February 7th, near the Tenaru, or Tanamboa, in some reports, George learned the most basic truth of sniper work again. Sooner or later, someone shoots back. A Japanese rifleman caught him on the left side, the bullet punching through muscle and spinning him to the ground. Hayes dragged him to cover and yelled for a corpsman. The wound was bad enough to end his part in the campaign, but not his life. No bone shattered, no artery cut. He woke up in a field hospital near Henderson Field, staring at white canvas instead of banyan branches. While he healed, word filtered in. The Japanese were gone. Their evacuation completed on February 9th. Guadalcanal, this brutal, muddy, tree-choked proving ground, was finished. The sniper section he had built was officially recognized. Colonel Ferry put George in for a Bronze Star. But the Pacific still had more jungles, more rivers, more distant ridgelines where a man who could read wind and wait for movement might be useful. Somewhere beyond Guadalcanal, another mission was taking shape, one with a name that would become legend. Merrill's Marauders. The field hospital on Guadalcanal gave George 2 weeks to heal and to think. The war, of course, didn't pause for him. While he watched nurses move between cots and listened to stretchers come and go, orders were already moving across the Pacific, reshuffling men like pieces on a map. When he was fit enough to move, his path didn't point home. It pointed west. Somewhere in Burma, planners envisioned a different kind of unit. Long-range penetration forces that would slip behind Japanese lines, live off scant supplies, and strike where the enemy felt safe. The army needed officers who understood jungle, patience, and the art of killing at distance. George volunteered. By March 1943, he was on a transport heading toward India. His Winchester traveled with him, packed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold, scope wrapped carefully in oilcloth. He didn't know the details yet, only that the mission involved Burma, mountains, and operations deep in enemy territory. To any man who'd walked the banyan groves of Guadalcanal, that sounded familiar enough. The transport reached India on April 3rd. There, George and about 200 other officers were briefed. They were joining a new 3,000-man unit with no formal lineage and no ceremonial history, just a string of numbers. The 5,307th Composite Unit, Provisional. The men gave it a better name, borrowed from its commander, Brigadier General Frank Merrill. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The Marauders were modeled on British Brigadier Orde Wingate's Chindits, jungle raiders who slipped through enemy territory, hit supply lines, and vanished. Training in central India was relentless. Long marches, jungle survival, navigation without clear trails, and combat drills in terrain that would mimic Burma's choking green corridors. Heat and humidity wrapped everything in a constant, suffocating cloak. George took a hard look at his rifle. The Winchester Model 70 had been perfect for the static, tree-lined kill zones of Point Cruz. Burma would be different weeks-long patrols, minimal resupply, everything carried on backs or pack mules. Every ounce that wasn't food, water, or ammunition had to earn its keep. He decided to strip the rifle down. The Lyman Alaskan scope came off, replaced by a lighter Weaver 330 with the same 2.5x magnification, but 8 ounces less weight. It seemed trivial on paper, but in a jungle where a man might carry 60 pounds for hundreds of miles, 8 ounces mattered. He swapped the wooden stock for a lighter version, shaving more weight. The rifle dropped from about 9 pounds 12 ounces to 8 pounds 14. Not a revolution, but enough to feel at the end of a long day. The marauders crossed into Burma in February 1944. Their mission: advance through northern Burma and take the airfield at Myitkyina, a critical link in the Allied supply route into China. Japanese forces in the area numbered around 4,000. The marauders would reach them the hard way through impassable mountains and jungle. No vehicles, no artillery, just rifles, light mortars, and mules staggering under loads. The first week alone covered 83 miles of mountainous jungle. Men collapsed on the trail. Malaria, dysentery, typhus diseases that didn't care about rank or bravery began collecting their own toll. Pack mules slipped on muddy slopes and broke legs. Some had to be shot and left where they fell. The march ground on. By March, the battalion had covered 217 miles, fighting a dozen small engagements along the way, ambushes, quick firefights, hit-and-run clashes that left trails of brass and bodies in the dripping undergrowth. George used his Winchester exactly 3 times on that march, once at about 412 yards, dropping a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing, once at roughly 380 yards, taking out a machine gun crew anchoring an enemy line, once at 290 yards, silencing a sniper pinning down a marauder patrol, 3 shots, 3 kills, and each time he moved immediately, refusing to give the peculiar crack of the Winchester a second chance to betray his position. The long-range precision that had dominated his days at Point Cruz now appeared only in brief flashes. Most fights happened at 50 yards or less, green walls of foliage, sudden bursts of fire, and then disappearance. The Winchester remained deadly, but the war was changing around it. The march to Myitkyina broke men in ways bullets never could. By late May, Merrill's marauders had covered more than 700 miles through northern Burma. They'd fought Japanese along jungle trails and riverbanks, but the bigger enemy wore no uniform. Malaria, dysentery, typhus, exhaustion. The unit that had gone in with over 5,000 men was down to fewer than 3,000 fit for duty. Some companies could barely put a platoon in line. On May 17th, 1,944, after weeks of maneuvering and skirmishing, the marauders reached their objective. Myitkyina airfield, key to supplying China and outflanking Japanese positions, fell into American hands. It was a victory, but a hollow one. The men who limped onto that airfield were shadows of the force that had started the march. George and his Winchester had done their part. 7 confirmed long-range kills in 3 months, each shot chosen carefully, each shot fired once. But as the campaign wore on, he saw the pattern. The majority of marauder firefights were brutal. Close-range encounters, 30 feet in the bamboo, sudden ambushes, bursts of semi-automatic fire. The elegant precision of a bolt-action sporting rifle had fewer and fewer chances to matter. By June, the marauders were spent. The unit was pulled out of the line, officially disbanded, its survivors evacuated. George left Burma alive, his rifle still serviceable, but he understood something on that long ride out. The Winchester Model 70 had been almost perfectly suited to one narrow slice of the war, the banyan groves of Guadalcanal, the patient game of hunter, and hunted at a few hundred yards. Modern warfare, though, was drifting towards something else: massed fire, semi-automatic rifles like the Garand, interchangeable parts, standardized training. The future would have room for snipers, but not for privately purchased mail-order sweethearts carried against orders. He was reassigned to the United States. In July 1944, the Army promoted him to captain and sent him to Fort Benning, Georgia, to train infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught them what the jungle had taught him: how to move through thick terrain without advertising your presence, how to read distance and wind at a glance, how to fight when you couldn't count on supply lines. The Winchester stayed with him, traveling from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma and now to Georgia, slowly becoming less a weapon and more a relic. George left the Army in January 1947 as a lieutenant colonel, with 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and a combat infantryman badge. He went home and, like so many veterans, started over. The GI Bill took him to Princeton University, where he studied politics and graduated with highest honors in 1950. Then came 4 years at Oxford, and 4 more in British East Africa studying politics and institutions on the ground. Eventually, he settled in Washington, D.C., as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations, later working with the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute as a consultant and lecturer on African affairs. Through all of that, he almost never spoke about Guadalcanal or Burma. Colleagues knew he'd been in the Pacific, but not about the 11 snipers in the banyan trees, or the days in the water-filled crater, or the battered Winchester Model 70 that lay in its case at home. In 1947, he began writing down what had happened not as a memoir for glory, but as a technical record while the details were fresh. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript poured past 400 pages, dense with descriptions of weapons, ballistics, and tactics. A friend at the National Rifle Association read it and pushed for publication. George hesitated. It wasn't a heroic fairy tale. It was blunt, clinical, sometimes unflattering. But he agreed. The book, Shots Fired in Anger, appeared and quietly became a classic among shooters and historians. Its descriptions of Japanese and American small arms in real combat are still considered some of the sharpest ever written. George lived long enough to watch 3 more American wars: Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf. He saw rifles evolve from the Garand to the M14 to the M16. He watched sniping become a formal specialty, with schools, doctrine, and dedicated equipment that owed more than a little to lessons he'd lived. John George died on January 3, 2009, at age 90. His Winchester Model 70, the toy rifle that had slaughtered ghosts in the Point Cruz groves, was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It rests there now behind glass, a simple hunting rifle to most visitors who walk past without stopping. They don't see the mud of Guadalcanal on its stock, or the rain of Burma on its barrel. But you know what it is. It's the rifle that proved a state champion marksman with a mail-order scope could outshoot professional snipers. The rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days when a whole battalion couldn't do it in 2 weeks. The rifle that helped push the American military to rethink what one skilled shooter could do. If this story moved you the way it's moved generations of readers, do one thing before you go. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Every single click tells the algorithm that stories like John George's matter, that these men and their hard-earned lessons shouldn't vanish into silence. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if someone in your family served. You're not just an audience, you're part of the chain that keeps these memories alive.